ये बंद कर दिया तो वो बंद हो जाता क्या? ये बंद कर दिया तो वो बंद हो जाता? अच्छा, थैंक यू। ठीक है, रहने दीजिए। Good morning. On behalf of the editors and organizers, I extend a warm welcome to all of you. Quite often in international politics, when we discuss international politics, the conversation tend to revolve around geopolitical, geoeconomic, geostrategic, and other related issues. These are often defined as hard security issues. On the other hand, references to values in international politics are often made as a passing remark, while from a political perspective, they are often reiterated during various political campaigns and international interactions. I am happy to see that so many of you are here to participate in a discussion on values in foreign policy. The theme of the book or the project was essentially an idea of Sri Krishnan Srinivasan, former Foreign Secretary of India, and it evolved through numerous discussions. The editors of this book did not use values to denote binary opposites such as good and bad. Values in this book are defined as principles or frameworks that tend to influence political actions and beliefs. There are a host of questions that this book seeks to reflect on. Quite often, values and national interests are defined as antithetical. It is possible that values constitute national interests. For policymakers, are national interests always predefined? If so, what impact do religion, culture, institutional frameworks have on pursuit of predefined national interests? If national interests are not always predefined, then what impact do religion, culture, and institutional frameworks have on the construction of the national interests? These are some of the questions that went into formulation of this project. The project was initiated when I was here at ICRIER. I am grateful for the support that I received from Dr. Rajat Katuria and the rest of the leadership team. We are also grateful to Tata Trust, which financially supported this project for over 3 years. As a part of this project, we organized authors workshop. There are 3 components to this project. As a part of this project, we organized an authors workshop wherein all proposed chapters were discussed in detail and feedback was given to the chapters, and then it went into publication, which the book will be released shortly. The second component of the project includes a website on values in foreign policy, to which many policymakers, academicians, young scholars have also contributed. Some of those young scholars who contributed to the website are here around this table. When they submitted, they were young, but now they have become very established scholars, I must say. You can access this website by clicking on foreignpolicy.org.in. The third component of the project involves facilitating conferences and panel discussions. We organized a conference in March this year, and then we organized a series of panel discussions in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Calcutta. This is the 4th panel discussion that we are having in India today. Many people have contributed to the success of this project. I am grateful to Shri Shakti Sinha for encouraging me to complete this project. He is someone who believes in giving space to researchers to work on various projects. We, the editors, are also grateful to the authors who have contributed to the book as well as to the website. We are also grateful for the support we received from ICRIER's administrative and financial teams. Specifically, I would like to thank Geeta Nair, the administrative in charge, and the rest of the accounts team. I'll be failing in my duty if I don't thank Manmeet, Neha, and Krishan for all the logistical support. They work with great coordination and fantastic precision in organizing things. Of course, we have benefited immensely from the technical support we received from Rajkumar, who hosted the website and all other technical arrangements that you see around here. Lastly and importantly, I would also like to recognize Ms. Saranya Sarkar for her perseverance in completion of various tasks associated with this project. She has been a pillar around which a lot of activities have been operationalized. I have gained immensely from my interactions from Professor Mail and Krishnan over the past few years, I am sure. This is just one project that we are doing, and we will do more in coming years. I know all this sounds like a vote of thanks given at the conclusion of a conference and a workshop, but I hope you will recognize my eagerness to express gratitude for the support that we received from various quarters. A project of this magnitude would not be possible without guidance, support, and collaboration from various people and institutions. Today we have scholars, practitioners, or some would call them the scholar practitioners, to discuss the book and related themes. So let's move on with the book release, and I would request Sri Shakti Sinha to take over the proceedings.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that introduction. The program is in front of you, but I'll make a slight change to it. It's better that we get the two people two out of the three, who were involved in the book, Professor James Mal and Sanjay, to speak. Sanjay has just spoken, given his point of view. May I now request James. You can speak from here, you can speak from there.
I'll speak from here if you can hear me. I turn this.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Well, thank you very much for. Now can you hear?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just saying to thank Sanjay and his team for putting on this excellent discussion. It's a huge privilege and pleasure to be here again, and to rather inadequately stand in Krishnan's, as our lead editor, Krishnan's shoes, as he can't be here today. We're constantly reminded these days that we live in a globalized world, that most of the really intractable problems confronting humanity are no respecters of boundaries. Indeed, that they cross them with the ease of the mosquito or the tsetse fly. It follows, or so liberal opinion will have us believe, that we need a new universalism, a reassertion of the shared principles of a common humanity that will somehow allow us to prioritize our universal international interest over the parochial national interests that divide us. And yet, somehow we still regard with suspicion the rootless cosmopolitan, the citizen of nowhere who has no difficulty in loving humanity, but has problems with understanding, let alone empathizing with the problems of ordinary people. In our book, which we have just launched here, we are tackling this problem from the other way round. We are looking not so much at the problems of a common humanity, but how we approach those problems from our various different locales, political cultures, and interests. While for some, globalization and universalism are one and the same thing, proving beyond reasonable doubt that the principles of open markets and the free movement of people and capital will put an end to national divisions and conflicts. For others, they're polar opposites. On the second view, globalization is a new and aggressive form of imperialism, designed to subject the world everywhere to the deadening logic of the profit motive. A few months ago, I was privileged to listen to Albie Sachs, one of the leading architects of the South African Constitution, and a very courageous man also. And he argued that the one good thing about the apartheid system in South Africa was that it created the anti-apartheid movement. And similarly, he went on to express the hope that the one good thing about globalization would be that it would create the conditions for a genuine universalism, in which people everywhere would gradually come to acknowledge the necessity of recognizing the other's rights on the basis of their common humanity. Unfortunately, it seems to me, there are two major problems with this courageous but optimistic view. The first is the problem of contested histories and positional goods. Many intractable problems in international relations arise because the stories on each side of the border that we tell ourselves cannot be reconciled. They cannot be reconciled whether the border is a territorial border or the border is a communal border. Nonetheless, our experiences on both sides differ, and the stories that come out clash. The second problem arises as a consequence of nationalism. It may be, indeed I think it probably is, that all nation states are pursuing the same goals: the welfare and security of their populations. But the fact that their languages, their political cultures, their values and social customs differ enormously creates obstacles to cooperation and maximizes the chance of even well-meaning efforts getting, and I borrow from that marvelous film about a hapless American lost in Tokyo, lost in translation. So how should we think about resolving, or at least managing, the problems that arise from conflicting principles, whether real or imagined, and national practices and worldviews that divide rather than unite humanity? My answer to that is, let's rely more on the diplomats. Diplomats do not always enjoy a good press, particularly in this era of social media and the internet. For those who've heard me say this before, please forgive me repeating it. But it always seems to me that just as dog owners tend to come to resemble their dogs, so people complain that diplomats often seem to have more in common with each other than the people they allegedly represent. That is normally advanced as a criticism. I think it's a considerable asset. It is very important that in a very complex, culturally and value-divided world, we have a set of experts who are used to talking to one another, who tend to, the danger of them seeing the world too myopically the same seems to me less than the danger of them coming from clashing because they are so passionately embedded in their own positions. However, empathy, which they have to explore, is an indispensable attribute of generalship. And you'll forgive me if I shamelessly change the metaphor. It is necessary to see the world as the opposing general sees it, to think his thoughts and understand his motivations, to walk a mile, as the Native American proverb has it, in his moccasins. But it's not only on the battlefield that we need to understand those whose interests are opposed to our own, but in our everyday lives, those with whom we wish to cooperate, but whose historical experience, worldview, and cultural assumptions and practices are different from our own and may create unintended obstacles to harmonious relations across frontiers. In our book, we've sought to interrogate this subject, which I think is so far been understudied in the literature of international relations. Values, and in more recent times ideologies, have always played an important role in international affairs. The Holy Roman Empire, or the so-called free world during the Cold War, are examples of supranational entities or constructs which invoked values rather than interests as the primary impulse behind their conduct. More recently, powerful countries, primarily the US, but also those in the European Union and the industrial West, and a number of the chapters in our book are written to explore this aspect, including my own. These have cited routinely the defense or promotion of freedom and democracy in support of actions which may, at least in large part, be primarily driven by the pursuit of national interest rather than the values in which they are cast. Increasingly, the real drivers are the advancement of economic or strategic advantage, no matter how the accompanying narrative is couched. Conversely, in exceptional cases, values are so deeply held, for example, in post-revolutionary Iran or Saudi Arabia's adherence to Islam, that promoting or defending them becomes an overwhelming national interest. And for all countries, as I've suggested, it seems to me the idiom of projecting the national interest is through the prism of values. It's almost unavoidable. Much of the time, therefore, an understanding of the national interest of countries, or rather how they perceive their national interest, is what we need to make sense of how and why they act in certain ways in the international arena. Values, as in ethical or moral principles or ideologies, as in democracy or in communitarian systems of belief, are no longer central to foreign policy decisions in many countries. Frequently, what is relevant and sometimes key is the collective self-perceptions, enduring habits, precepts, and personality traits, even customary ways of doing business derived from the history and culture of a people. This is possibly best understood as a mix of national character with traditional security and foreign policy doctrines. Studying these is sometimes as rewarding, if not more rewarding, than understanding the underlying values in their own terms as the motivation of policy actions. I'm not sure of the truth of what I'm saying, but it seems to me that this may be especially true of nations with long historical or civilizational traditions, such as India or China. National character and tradition remain important to foreign policy choices and the diplomatic styles of several countries. Their organic roots in the fiber of society give them abiding strength. Almost by definition, they're seen as helping to sustain the national project over the long term, even when questions are raised over immediate gains or losses. The debate between idealists and realists in the practice of diplomacy and in the study of international affairs is neither new nor, it seems to me, about to end. The former stress the indispensability of values, ideas, and principles that must govern relations amongst nations, whereas the latter are convinced that national interest alone is and should be the driver for a state's policy and behavior towards the rest of the world. But neither camp has a monopoly on wisdom. Life and the world are not binary. Nothing is absolute here. Everything is relative. Hence, a path paved solely by values or by naked self-interest is often unobtainable. Nor it may not even exist. An individual needs both values and the capacity to define, identify, and pursue his or her interests within the framework of social norms, laws, and imperatives of community interest if he or she is to secure happiness and harness their potential. That's also what states do in the Comity of Nations. And I notice, I haven't read the book, but I noticed from a recent review in the Times Literary Supplement that a prominent American psychologist has just written a highly contentious book arguing that people and nations are much the same. In our book, all aspects of this debate are covered with reference to some of the leading countries in international society at the present time. Our work explores the effect of the Enlightenment, and I find this particularly as my country seems to have abandoned the Enlightenment, which it has always claimed to be at the root of its policy. We'll find out how far it's abandoned it tomorrow when we go to the polls. But I'm not hopeful. But we've examined the Enlightenment in our book, and of course it is a major problem. I noticed in the paper this morning a picture of the Indian economist receiving the Nobel Prize. It was a brilliant symbol of what we're talking about in this book. There he was dressed in an immaculately pressed dhoti, but taking the prize for a subject in which Indians have excelled, which derived from the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. And of course, the Enlightenment claimed to be universal. And liberals are still in a thorough muddle about whether it in fact was universal, and if so, what's it grounded in, or whether it was just the parochial hubris of the top countries of the day. And that problem is one which we grapple with a little bit in this book, but probably not because it's unresolvable totally satisfactorily. But anyway, we've dealt with that in our book, but we dealt with many other subjects, with colonialism, with modernity and post-modernity, and so on, in determining contemporary value systems which are often uncomfortable in their interface with each other. We hope that the mix of practitioners and academics who we were, when I say we, actually, Krishnan and Sanjay were primarily responsible for putting together, have provided us with a fair path-breaking exercise in opening up a field which we think deserves much more intense investigation than it has received so far. So with that, if I may, I will recommend our book to you and look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Professor Van. We are running exactly on time. 2 speakers done, 11:29 on the board. It's a very good way to talk about values. In fact, when I first heard about this topic, values, March or February or whenever, I was reminded of this book discussion in Washington, D.C. 2 decades ago. So the PhD thesis made into a book on liberalism in Peking University. And the first commentator said, it must be a really thin book. It wasn't actually. So I think values, also some of the reviewers said, what are you talking about? Values, foreign policy? One is hard realpolitik and the other is... And that, I think, tensions runs through the book. I mean, are values ethical, purely ethical constructs? Are they guiding principles? Or are they a combination of both? And though in the introduction, the editors have firmly opted for guiding principles, but in actually describing situations, the authors, including the editors, have flip-flopped between guiding principles and ethical values. And because the word value itself is such a loaded word, I guess one cannot distance oneself from it. And values guide a lot of things. Professor Mal makes a point, and here I would just gently disagree with him, when he says that why values in foreign policy, why not in domestic policy like health and education? Because he says, and I agree with that part of it, you're dealing with other countries, so you have different interests and you want cooperation, you don't want conflict. But I would slightly extend it to even domestic policy. It is my values which should determine, to some extent, to a great extent, what my education policy should be. Should I be looking at universal minimum levels of education, school levels for everybody? Or do I feel that can wait and I opt for a model which has some emphasis on lower education, more on higher education? Or as Singapore had till very recently, from class 3 onwards, they started identifying students who they thought would not cope with higher education and therefore should be pushed towards the vocational line. So in other words, values do have a place in policy making. What are the values is something which is always very difficult to get around it. But yes, the tensions between values, word is in foreign policy, are they universal? The 93 contestation has been over, that's fine. The so-called Asian value system is also no more much in use now, though some references are there. But the fact is that at what stage does which society in a social development, economic development, political development, come to adopt certain values? Because values cannot be de-linked from society in the sense that both feed on each other. Social changes, political changes do impact on values and vice versa. If you're completely de-linked from it, obviously the dystopian world that you're looking at. And therefore, through the emphasis on human rights or labor standards in the field of trade, how relevant is it, or is it the West pushing back and trying to stop the others from growing? Or the debate in environment is to be, you guys are polluted, now it's our time to pollute. Can that argument really be sustained over a long term? So values does come into our thinking at every given moment of time, even though you cannot de-link realism in whatever form, whether it's excessive realism, or as our Chinese author Zhang Lihua calls it, aggressive realism. You have different words of attached with realism attached now. to it. And therefore, the two cannot be completely. And therefore, these norms that have been laid down, how relevant are them to everybody? And can we look at it differently? And that is something which, studying political science, I find it many times the words do strain, the definitions, the categorizations do strain hard. I'll just give an example. Now, the BJP is always described as the Hindu nationalist party. Now, if you read Krishna Srinivasan's piece on Indian foreign policy, there's a lot about Nehru. If you read those Nehru sentences, whatever his justification of putting his ashes in the Sangam, saying it's not religious but it is emotional, if you read Nehru's lines throughout, Nehru comes across as somebody very strongly grounded in what he thinks are the Indian past. So our definition of the past will vary, our understanding of the past varies, very strongly grounded in the old Hindu, Buddhist ethos kind of thing. Again and again, Nehru talks about it. So Nehru was, in that sense, a Hindu, and Nehru was a nationalist. So, some words do tend to, or forget Nehru, let's take other people also. Many people very strongly on the secular side of the debate, quote unquote, are people who are extremely guided by their religious principles in their political life, but they're not of the BJP. So, these categorizations sometimes, and especially categorizations like liberal, conservative, right, left, the most extreme Muslim jihadist groups are described as right. To me, a right is a person who believes in free trade, believes in free movement of people, believes in a minimum government, none of which can be applied to, say, the Taliban, as an example. So you do have difficulties with definitions, the same words, so you are lost in translation very regularly, the same words meaning different to different people. And therefore the need to broadly understand, but the book has limitations. Mr. Bhatia has pointed out in his review, Africa is missing, Latin America is missing. He suggests dropping Sanjay's chapter on Myanmar and putting in Brazil instead, or Nigeria. Of course, the debate will never end. The debate can never end. No book can really cover the whole world. So obviously, editors have to make a choice in what can be done and cannot be done. But broadly speaking, when you look at this thing, there is a very strong feeling in us, and I'm sure in other societies also, that we are exceptional. We are different. We are meant to bring peace to the world. We don't think only about ourselves, we think about the world, etc. And everybody cites Bahuda, cites the famous Vasudeva Kutumbakam. I would say if you really want to cite something, don't cite Vasudeva Kutumbakam. Cite the other one, which is far better to me at least, which is the Bahuda Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. In other words, there is one truth, but you see it differently. The wise see it differently. So that, in fact, conveys the fact that for Indians to reconcile opposites is relatively easy. And somebody cited also saying that to a Hindu, a definite solution is a bad solution. We don't like definite solutions. Conrad Ailes says so. Because reality for a lot of us and values for a lot of us, and I'm using the word Hindu very broadly, is that reality for a lot of us is contextual. It is not rigid. It is not fixed in time or fixed in a place. And which is why the ability to seemingly be contradictory will always remain. And if that is Indian exceptionalism, to me, that is the Indian exceptionalism far greater than trying to bring peace to the world. The fact that you are comfortable in diverse situations and don't see one as false and the other is true. Which is what, if you have a very rigid ethical norms, you run into this trouble. Is speaking the truth always the right thing to do? Is speaking the truth means somebody loses his life, somebody you're protecting? Is that speaking the truth the right thing to do? So if you don't have very rigid, but you allow for contextuality, I think that is what gives some strength to the Indian system to bounce back. But it is very interesting to read the chapter in America, to be reminded that the first person who broke away from this universalism post-World War II was President Nixon, when he tried to, in that sense, retrench from the world, get out of Vietnam, talk to the Chinese, talk to the Russians, try to see them as fine, let the systems be. I'm not promoting democracy in Russia or China, in that sense. Then, of course, it reverses again. Though the example of one more strong example of Nixon missing is the fact that he took the USA off the dollar guarantor. USA had guaranteed at Bretton Woods that the 35 ounce to the dollar, gold, 35 ounce of gold to the dollar, I shall redeem. That Nixon in 71 took it off. Not the gold standard in that sense, but the Bretton Woods agreement. Nixon got off it. So America in that sense actually retrenched from the world and allowed floating interest rates, floating exchange rates after that. But we wanted to have more. I think the book is a very useful beginning. China one needs much greater emphasis, understanding the whole Chinese concept of, and which is different from the others, the whole concept of under heaven. I don't know how to pronounce it in Chinese, Tangsha. Tangsha? Tianxia. That's how it's written. The Chinese don't say it the same way. Because when I said Tianxia, nobody understood a word in Peking. Then I wrote it in character, which I know. So then this I know. So Tianxia and Tianzi, the son of heaven. That is such a different worldview. And therefore for them, harmony means quite different from what harmony means to you. Same word, harmony. For them, harmony means you listen to me. Full stop. I mean, so you can't argue with that person on that level when you're into that arrangement. So only when you remove the arrangement. So it's so much more important to understand, because ultimately the rise of China in the last 4 decades, particularly after 2001 when it joined the WTO, when it agreed to certain commitments made, is seriously now challenging a lot of the global norms. China is now seriously getting into the rule-making business. They're trying to head the WIPO, intellectual property, which is something normally you would not have thought Chinese would get into it. The Chinese are seeing themselves quite differently. The emergence of the inherent Confucian norms, Taoism norms, is coming up to the fore. We need to better understand and engage with China. And I think that is why books like this are very, very important. We do have a tendency in India to think theory is bad. If you call somebody a theoretical admi hai, which means he knows nothing. That is a general thing. Arey to academic admi hai. But the whole idea of academic and theory is basically generalization of reality. So we need in Indian strategic thinking to get far more theoretical in the good, far more academic, to draw on principles through which we can analyze things, understanding the context. Because if you're analyzing things in the wrong context, using the wrong principles, you obviously will get a distorted answer. And to that extent, I think I'm very glad that this book is out here. It's not the end of the subject, as both the editors have said, initiators. This is the beginning of the subject. We definitely, I think, would need to work on this subject and understand it, flesh it out much further. With that, let me conclude my remarks. Thank you very much. I would now request our panelists. Till now, the editors and I have spoken. Now, we would definitely like to speak. So what order do we speak in? One practitioner, one this thing. Take a Preeti. Ambassador Preeti Saran. I would request her. Then I would request to switch sides to Sanjay Baru, and then to Raju Bhattacharya.
Good morning, and thank you. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate the editors and the young scholars who've now become established scholars, and all the contributors of this book for launching this. And so heartiest congratulations on that. So I'll just begin with a few comments that I had put down together for today's discussions. And I feel that in today's period of rising geopolitical rivalries, hard power matters more than anything else. Military capabilities, technological superiority, and economic heft are the strongest instruments of international political influence. And so then the question before us is to consider is that should nation states uphold values while they formulate their foreign policies? Or to put it differently, are there permanent values, or are there simply permanent interests in international politics? And what happens when these values come into conflict, as has been said before by Dr. Sinha as well as and Dr. Mayal, that when they come into conflict with a country's interests? How do countries deal with this in their foreign policies? And so in this context, as I said before, the publication of this book, Values in Foreign Policy, Investigating Ideals and Interests, is a refreshing reminder of the importance of values in foreign policy. And I completely agree that there must be a more complete academic focus, and where I agree with Ambassador Bhatia as well, that yes, I did find the Africa and Latin America missing from it. So we can say this is a good beginning, and I hope that you'll come out with a second volume that will make up for that absence. The book has compiled, of course, diverse views, and I really enjoyed reading them on the relevance of these principles and the importance of core universal value systems that are applicable to all nation states, or whether they can be applicable. This book is also, of course, a recapitulation of how the last century was governed by a clash of two major value systems of capitalism and communism, as borne out by the Cold War rivalries. As mentioned in the introduction of this book, the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, while not legally binding, provided a broad framework for countries to abide by their commitments. It influenced the constitutions of several newly independent states, leading to the adoption of the two international covenants, one on civil and political rights, and the other on economic, social, and cultural rights. Most countries signed onto these covenants. It testified that indeed it was possible to agree to common values in spite of the divergence of historical, civilizational, and cultural ethos of countries in the West and the rest of the world. Subsequent codification of several other individual rights of women, of children, of people with disabilities, on torture, on rights of refugees, migration, etc., were largely based on Western value systems, but advocated as universal values. These values of the victors govern the evolution of international norms and has done so for the last 100 years. This international order, of course led by USA and Europe, has had its fair share of double standards when core principles espoused of liberalism, of democracy, of human rights, and a rules-based order clashed with their national interests. Countries that advocated these values adjusted their strategies to prioritize national interest above all values of foreign policy. That notwithstanding, drafting of international laws on international trade, on transport, on communication, on intellectual property rights, and in this context to say that WIPO is now, China should be wanting to head it, seems a bit ironical, but climate change, etc., where nation states have undertaken to accept and to conform to an agreed system, reconfirm the willingness of countries to adhere to universally acceptable values. Respect for international laws itself becomes an important value in conducting foreign policy. In my work as a member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, I find that notwithstanding the differences and different levels of development, it is indeed possible for state parties to adhere to a value-based system to ensure the rights to these citizens, whether what levels of development they are at, what size of the country it is, what are their development challenges, differing political systems or national goals. So it is possible, I think. This established value system is now being challenged with the emergence of China as an alternative power source, as Dr. Shakti Sinha just mentioned. In its unilateral actions, certainly its unilateral actions clash with its self-professed efforts of building a community of shared future and a win-win in international affairs. So there is a very unique Chinese characteristics coming out of this new rulemaking. There are, of course, contradictions and actions from its own avowed 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And the obvious ones come to mind are violation of human rights of its own people, weaponization of its economic might to settle scores, belligerence instead of peaceful negotiations in settling its territorial disputes with other countries in South China Sea, aggression in global commons, its debt trap diplomacy couched under its Belt Road Initiative, and of course operating in disputed territories in the same projects. So clearly this is yet another example of self-interest in realpolitik, which is trumping over principles that are being espoused by the country concerned, as well as the international obligations that it has undertaken so far, and is in fact now positioned to actually be in the rulemaking role. So coming back to the book, the diversity of views expressed by eminent scholars on values and ethical principles provides invaluable insight into a very complex subject. It cannot be denied that there are core international values that should be given priority over parochial national interests. juxtaposed with other value systems, does India bring anything to the table? Dr. Shakti Sinha just mentioned that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is not the one which rightly describes it, but what about the Gandhian philosophy of ahimsa, which is deeply ingrained in the Indian psyche and which was the hallmark of our independence struggle? It certainly inspired several other countries in Asia and Africa during their independence movement. And I would imagine that some of the other values that Mr. Chris Srinivasan has brought out in his essay on values in Indian policy, particularly, the civilizational values of tolerance, of peaceful coexistence, and respect for nature, I think they remain as relevant today as they have been historically, civilizationally. Within our own subcontinent, what values have we followed over, our immediate neighborhoods? So I think I would say our own pluralistic values clash or militate against everything that, say, what Pakistan represents, whether it is in the context of its own national identity on the basis of one single religion, or its patronage of violent extremism, of radicalism, and to use cross-border terrorism as an instrument of state policy. So definitely that is a value that they prefer to uphold. So here are two countries that were created out of that same common historical, geographical, and civilizational space. To answer the other point that, yes, Dr. Mayal mentioned that a lot of the values depends upon, the historical, civilizational values of that country concerned. So here is an example of two countries created out of the same civilizational space, but they followed very divergent paths in pursuit of foreign affairs that were influenced by very different values that each chose to adopt. Last month, during the 4th Ramnath Goenka lecture, Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister of India, articulated India's diplomatic agenda, and in which he said, and I quote, has broadened considerably, as indeed have its partners in those endeavors. We share with the international community the objective that a multipolar world should have a multipolar Asia at its core. And to ensure that, India needs to follow an approach of working with multiple partners on different agendas. Obviously, they would each have their importance and priority, but Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas is today as relevant in foreign policy. It is the nations who have optimal mix of capabilities, of relationships, and positioning who can aspire to occupy the multiple roles of the emerging international order. And it is the confidence of being able to forge ahead in this looser architecture that can inspire us to emerge as a leading power in the future, unquote. As a diplomat, and I'd like to say that thank you for giving that, as a retired Indian diplomat, the primacy to the fact that leave it to diplomats to resolve, and that all of them begin to look much like the dogs and Moses analogy. I would say that, yes, an aspirational India does expound Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and of course, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam was one, but the other one, the civilizational, historical one about oneness of universe, I would give that an importance as well. And these could be important guiding principles in conduct of foreign policy, or even in international rule-making as we evolve it today, in this shifting sands of power rivalries, and who will be the author of the new rule-making internationally. I think some of these core Indian values can be a counterpoint to the antithetical values of others in the interest of peace and stability, both in our region as well as in conducting world affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. As she mentioned, she's a member of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is a part of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Before she retired as secretary, she used to be our ambassador in Vietnam and has done extensive work in the eastern side of India, so whether it's ASEAN, Mekong Ganga, BIMSTEC, etc. Now request Dr. Sanjay Baru, distinguished fellow IDSA, but more important, author that we all know, journalist, and he brings an economic perspective to Indian strategic thinking, one of the earliest to do so. Now increasingly more people are realizing that you can't study your strategic thinking without the economic parts of it. Sanjay?
Thank you, Shakti. It's a pleasure to be back at any career event. I think the last time I was here was again thanks to you, Sanjay. And we are
Sanjay are both friends of the
both,
team.
both namesakes from same part of India. So that explains partly my presence here. Let me preface my remarks by saying that I enjoyed reading this book and I reviewed the book. My review appeared on the website, thewire.in. I was very pleased to to be invited here because that suggests the authors did not mind my review. Because basically my view of the book was that it's a very interesting set of essays which end up telling us that values don't matter. That the introductory chapter itself, the authors make the statement that values give way to contingencies and circumstances and above all interests, and no government is able to chart a course by the compass of professed values alone, which I think is a realistic and honest assessment. But then we live in a world in which countries pretend to have values, and the most amusing pretense in this book is that of the Chinese writer, scholar Zhang Li Hua, who actually says, and I quote, "Once one understands the values of traditional Chinese culture, one can truly understand Chinese diplomacy because the political system and foreign policy of a country is rooted in its history and culture," unquote. So if Chinese foreign policy is rooted in its values and its history and culture, then of course all of us can claim that our foreign policy is rooted in our history and culture. So in a sense, I take the opposite view that at the end of the day, realism, national interest trumps values. Let me therefore say a couple of things. First, my own involvement with foreign policy, I'm not a student of foreign policy, I'm not a student of international affairs. I was never engaged in thinking about foreign policy till I discovered how important the shift in India's economic policy in 1991 was influenced by what was happening in the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union, India's dependence on US support for the IMF loan. And as an economist, I began to realize how international relations and our relations with the rest of the world shaped our own economic options. What we did in the 90s was really in the context of the end of the Cold War and a unipolar moment in which we became dependent on fund support and continued to talk the language of the pre-Cold War, of the Cold War, the non-alignment, etc., but increasingly became dependent on the West for our own economic revival. So it was in that context that I began looking at how the interaction between foreign policy and economic policy. Then came the 1998 nuclear tests, when the United States imposed sanctions, Japan imposed sanctions. And once again, we saw a very intimate relationship between the foreign policy choices we were making and our economic decisions we were taking. I actually led a delegation, I was member of a delegation led by former Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor Mani Dixit, J.N. Dixit, to Tokyo, which was sent by government of India at that time to plead with the Japanese to end, not plead, well that's a strong word, to request the Japanese to end their economic sanctions. The delegation consisted of Jasjit Singh, who was then director of IDSA, Mr. N.N. Vora, who was till recently governor of J&K, Mr. K. Subramaniam, who are all distinguished diplomats or civil servants, served the country. And I was the odd one out. I was at that time editor of the Financial Express. And I was asked to join this delegation basically to speak on how the Indian economy offered opportunities for Japanese business. So here was a delegation with a former foreign secretary, former defense secretary, former head of IDSA, current head of IDSA, going to Tokyo in a conversation with very senior similar diplomats from there. But the guy who had to do the real work was an economist editor whose job was to basically tell the Japanese audience that please end your sanctions so that you can get more money out of India. Here we are opening up our economy, there are all these economic opportunities, etc., etc., etc. And as of course all of you are aware, the impact of those sanctions was diluted. Neither the Americans nor the Japanese really imposed sanctions on us. And both countries began to change their attitude towards India. It was partly to do with the economic opportunity India offered. It was also to do with the rise of China and their desire to find a balance. But the economic development of India became central to the kind of foreign policy outreach. Much has been written, lots of books which make this argument now, so I won't waste your time with it. The second time, or the second opportunity I had to look at foreign policy more closely was in the period 2004-2008 when I had to write the Prime Minister's speeches. And I found that all the drafts that came from the Ministry of External Affairs, and I say this with apologies to both my fellow panelists, Preeti and Mr. Rajiv Bhatia, that a lot of the draft speeches that came from the MEA were full of a lot of nice words about things like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, India as a land of peace, all the nice things we say, non-alignment. And I had to constantly rewrite those speeches to make the point which at that point Dr. Manmohan Singh wanted to make, which is that India is a growing market, please come and invest in India, we are a liberal economy. I mean, the message was very much about the economy. And then we used to have these constant discussions internally on what should be the tone of the speech. And finally, my good fortune, I discovered a speech by Jawaharlal Nehru to the Constituent Assembly in December 1947, where Nehru goes in a great detail to suggest that at the end of the day, you cannot define India's, and he's telling members of the Constituent Assembly discussing foreign policy, you cannot define India's foreign policy without first defining our economic policy. I've quoted that in many of my writings. And so, I had the cover of Jawaharlal Nehru because more often than not, we quote Nehru's high-sounding speeches about peace and equality of nations and anti-colonial struggles, etc., etc. But here was a very stark quote which basically said that foreign policy cannot be defined without first defining our economic policy. So that is where I come from. Now, one can have arguments. I'm fully aware of counter-arguments, and I respect other views. But I believe that at the end of the day, the core of any country's foreign policy is its national interest. It can be defined in various ways. Economic interest is not necessarily the only element of national interest. For instance, during the Cold War, the United States defined its national interest as the defeat of communism, which it was not, the Soviet Union was not an economic challenge to the United States. But nevertheless, it had to be defeated because it's the ideology that the Soviet Union represented, which was a challenge to Western ideology. So ideology can become an important motive force of foreign policy. But then one could also argue that there were strategic interests. There was control over oil in the Middle East, access to natural resources in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and access to markets. So the Soviet-US rivalry was not just about ideology, but it was about access to markets, access to natural resources, and so on. So, this argument about which is more important will always go on. I would now like to spend a couple of minutes on making some observations about where we are today. In fact, it is just a coincidence that your function is this morning, which can become an important day in the way in which India looks at Indian foreign policy. Because from Nehru, who was the first prime minister who used the term Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in a speech of his, next Indira Gandhi, when she addressed the Rio conference or the Stockholm conference on the environment, was it Rio? I think Stockholm. Stockholm, 1982. The speech was written, I know, by Sharda Prasad, who in fact drew my attention to this, where she talked about, in the context of climate change, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Climate change was not the term in those days, but environment, the context of environmental concerns, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. To Manmohan Singh's speeches, there are at least half a dozen of his speeches on foreign policy where he talks about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And then I was quite surprised to see Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He has again another 4 or 5 important foreign policy speeches in the last 6 years where he has used the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And then in the acceptance speech of President Kovind, when he became President of India, in the acceptance speech he gives on being sworn in as President, he also again refers, and that is quoted in this book by Mr. Srinivasan. So, this idea comes right from Nehru through Indira, through Atalji, Manmohan Singh, and the current regime. So in some ways, it seems to be an important message that successive leaders of India have tried to give to the world, based on the idea of pluralism and secularism, which is inherent to the Indian state in the constitution. That here is a country of multiple religions, multiple languages, multiple ethnicities, multiple cultures and cuisines, one nation, unity in diversity, and therefore we believe that the whole world is one family. The idea of unity and diversity is the essence of, or Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is the essence of the idea of unity and diversity. Yesterday, the United States Committee for Religious Freedom issued a statement for the first time, in a sense, expressing serious concerns, demanding sanctions to be imposed on India for changes being made in our citizenship laws. I think this is a moment of truth for the country, whether we still believe in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam or not. It's not enough to give big speeches claiming all this great civilizational inheritance, if in essence we are going to discriminate between citizens on the basis of their religion. And if in fact other countries are serious, or certainly the United States is serious about sanctions, then the question arises whether for the first time our values are trumping our interests. Because India's economic interests require today a relationship with developed economies. Our economy is slowing down. Our economy is in a crisis. I don't know how many of you are aware that while Moody's Investor Services downgraded India from stable to negative last month, last week, they upgraded Pakistan from negative to stable. Yeah. So, at a time when the economy is slowing down, when you have major problems with exports and we are looking at investments from the rest of the world, what is the message we want to give to the rest of the world? Because the great strength of this country was essentially its pluralism. That here was a country that took pride in Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That every Prime Minister, including Prime Minister Modi, has said that this is the guiding principle of Indian foreign policy. That we are an inclusive society. We have been home to refugees from the Zoroastrian refugees from the scourge of extremist radical Islam in Persia. We have been home to Jews persecuted by Europe. Are we not willing to be home to others in years to come? These are important issues. I'm hoping that they'll be resolved in a way that all of us feel comfortable with the values that our foreign policy continues to espouse. But I think today is an interesting day when these issues are there in front of us, and we cannot simply talk theory without looking at the ground reality.
Thank you, Sanjay. So, we have done our rounds of the... Dr. Bhatia, how did I forget? My God, sorry, I got carried away. Not at all. Distinguished Fellow at the Foreign Policy Studies Gateway House. He's been a Director General ICWA, where he really increased its, what should I say, visual presence a lot through engagements with think tanks all over the world. Our ambassador to Myanmar, South Africa, Kenya, Mexico, and a written book on Indo-Myanmar relations to bookend the discussions with your enlightened words.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear friends, I'm really grateful to ICRIER and to my friends, Sanjay and Saranya, to have invited me to this very stimulating discussion this morning on a subject which is of great importance, and I plan to focus myself entirely on this book and the theme of this book. And I'm very grateful that I've been given the chance to speak last, which means that I cannot have the last word, but I would like to at least put some words which will hopefully trigger some dialogue and discussion as well. I'm also grateful for the small mercies shown by Professor Mayall, because although I retired from the diplomatic service 10 years back, when I hear of a reference to diplomats, my ears perk up. So I'm grateful to him that he compared diplomats to other diplomats and not to dogs and their owners. I also want to say that I, unlike Sanjay Baru, gave a very positive review to this book in the Hindu. And I did this after very deep study and reflection. I read the book, and I came to the conclusion that unlike many books that appear today in this field, here is a book which really presents a unique theme, uniquely treated. And I think it must have been very difficult for the three editors to have actually composed this book. Each of them, by the way, is a contributor to an essay, which means the three editors are three authors, and then there are others. And putting everything together, it must have been a Herculean task, particularly because people also live in different geographies. So a good theme, I think extremely well handled, and I certainly enjoyed reading it, and I benefited and profited from it. Now let us dive straight into the fundamental debate about values and interests. We all know that in foreign policy, at the end of the day, when there is a clash between values and interests, the latter prevail. This is not rocket science. But still, the question that needs to be asked is, are the values important in foreign policy or not? Are they relevant in the international affairs or not? And I would say that they are relevant and they are important. And I need not invent any very complex arguments to convince an Indian audience that values are important. Now, we always learn from the beginning that value system and values are important to an individual. If they're important to an individual, they're also important to the family. If they are important to the family, they are also important to very many community organizations. If that is the case, how come suddenly they disappear from the life of nation state? It is illogical. It's simply not logical to claim that when the nations deal with other nations, values simply disappear. This is not the case. And as a result, I think in a panel which is dominated by Sanjay as this morning, I can hardly remind Bhishma Pitama in the Mahabharata, which always begins with Sanjaya Uvach, who holds forth on the concept of the dharma. And Shri Krishna, who also talks about dharma. And they don't make a distinction between dharma only of individual or family and exclude the state from there. We also know about the Raj Dharma as well. And therefore, I feel that this book creates a resonance in my mind when it says that values are important and significant, but it's not arguing at all that values are more important than the interests. So there is that complex argument that has to be appreciated. The editors did a very brilliant job by defining the term values. It is not about telling truth or not stealing or being non-violent. It is about political principles that define your identity as a nation state. And that helps you to interpret your national interest. That is about all, and that is why they are able to harmonize this apparent contradiction as to how values and interests can harmonize. I would like particularly to point out that in galaxy of chapters, and you know all the authors are well-known scholars, we simply have to take them seriously. I picked up in particular three: US, India, and China. Now in US, I think we all are agreed that America has traveled a long way from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which led to the birth of the League of Nations and eventually the United Nations, to the age of Donald Trump. The travel that America has done today, and the way now they are talking about unilateralism, protectionism, isolationism, America first and the world last. This kind of situation is totally remarkable, and I think while we all know that the elections in America will be about, at the end of the day, domestic issues and economic policies and the quality of leadership, the results will pronounce on the values of American foreign policy as well. Clearly, if Mr. Trump comes back again, it would show that Americans do believe in what he is doing to the world. Whether the world believes in him or not, that is a separate issue. In the chapter on China, I think this is where I do agree completely with the previous panelist, Sanjay Baru. This is, without being too diplomatic about it, a bizarre chapter. It is a chapter which says that China believes in all the good values and virtues of life, and it concludes that China does not dominate the world. It does not have the will to domineer the world. It runs so directly contrary to everything that we read and hear and internalize that maybe we can request later to the editors as to what really was behind the making of this particular chapter. On India, I have some disagreements with the previous panelists, but I think Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan, who was one of the brightest foreign secretaries to have served this nation, he was making a point by not talking too much about the present and talking a lot about how the foreign policy began in this country. He was making the point that to assess and evaluate Modi's foreign policy, the time has not yet come. The show is still on, and scholars will have to simply wait for a few more years, maybe for many more years, before they would be able to pronounce themselves decisively and clearly. But meantime, I think for every student of foreign policy, the earlier decades and the way the foreign policy was recalibrated during P.V. Narasimha Rao's time, they are the defining phases and defining moments, and therefore highlighting them made a lot of sense. I also want to point out here in particular that when people say values don't matter in foreign policy, listen to what our previous foreign minister said. Here is a sentence from Madame Sushma Swaraj, late Sushma Swaraj, who said, we have to commit to the ideas of a rules-based order, equality under international law, peaceful resolution of disputes, and equitable distribution of the benefits of globalization. These are all values. These are all goals. Do they not serve our interests? They do. So clearly, there would be situations when sometimes actually one reinforces the other times when there would be conflict. And that is where the policy making and the statesmanship come into picture, into play, in order to help us to determine the correlationship between the two. I would put forward another argument. Rarely you would find a person who has anything to do with foreign policy who would question the concepts such as inclusiveness. You cannot read, for example, almost any speech today by any political leader without a reference to the word inclusiveness or sustainable. Can you think of calling development without the word sustainable? No. Equitable or stable and peaceful. These are all denotions of a certain kind of political values and principles which have become very much in our own interest. And therefore, this dichotomy really does not exist. And I agree with Professor Mayall when he said the life is not binary. I know what correct values are. I do not follow them all the time. But does it mean that the values cease to exist? No. They are important as the yardstick by which we have to determine and measure and judge our actions. Remember what happened just about 3 weeks back. Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Bangkok gives a short statement to explain why India will not go ahead with RCEP. And you remember he said, Gandhi's talisman. The moment he said, all of us understood what he was saying. That key phrase may not have been understood abroad, but it was understood by every Indian. If this is not the stamp of values in foreign policy discourse, what it is. Finally, I would essentially like to say that reference was made to my mild criticism about some omissions. First of all, you have to appreciate a book reviewer has to criticize you for something. He cannot be taken seriously by the editor if he does not criticize the book. And I certainly thought of Myanmar, which is a strong bond between me and Sanjay, and particularly on this day today, a very special day, when the great champion of human rights is about to rise at the international platform to defend what most people think is completely indefensible. I suggested that the kind of resources and the kind of networking the editors had, I think just with a little bit of more effort, they could have encompassed 2 or 3 countries from Africa and Latin America, and it would have enhanced truly the value of the book. But that is only also to suggest that this is indeed probably the first volume, and as either these people or other people come forward, they might do something to really cover the rest of the world. So in the end, fundamentally, I want to say on this debate of values and interests, Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, they were on the wrong side of the history, but Buddha, Gandhi, to a large extent Nehru and Mandela got it right. And that is what my response is to this fundamental theme of this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. In fact, when you're speaking about Aung San Suu Kyi, as you know, the other Asian politician to have got, of this part of the world, to have got the Nobel Peace Prize was a gentleman from East Timor, Jose Ramos Horta, who has said that the West has been unfair to Aung San Suu Kyi. She's actually said that. And yes, values do matter. After all, unlike the Philippines-China case, when the India-Bangladesh case went to the PCA, and the Permanent Arbitration gave an award which was 70% of the disputed area to Bangladesh and 30% to India, we accepted it quietly. Having said we believe in rules-based order, we did accept it. So it's not that rules are completely divorced from our functioning. We now have, ladies and gentlemen, about 35 minutes. If I take away 5 minutes for vote of thanks, but we have given most of the vote of thanks on this Sunday. So we can take, Sunday will give it of course, but we can take 2 minutes from that. So we have, please raise your hands or show me that you're interested in. Okay. Of course, you will need a mic, sir. You will need a mic. You will need a mic. I'll come to you.
No, there is a microphone. No, microphone is...
Microphone is coming to you. So we'll take 3, 4 at a time and then go on ahead. Yeah, I'll come to the young people. One senior, one young. Don't worry.
I'm Dinesh Sharma. My question is to Dr. Baru, whom I very highly respect. He made 2 points. One is the value of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Second, he said about the threat of sanctions on India on the citizenship issue. I'm surprised that Dr. Basu took only one-sided view of this thing. America, USA under Mr. Trump is the worst performer when it comes to citizenship issue. America, USA is the only country which has separated children, parents from their children. And it has not happened in India so far. But still USA is there. So should India listen to change its policy because there is a threat of sanction, or it is against the values of India, of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam?
Thank you for the question. Behind. There's somebody behind. Please raise your hands so that they'll know where to give the piche. Then I'll come to you in front. And then we'll come to you. We'll take this 4. Okay.
Good morning to the panelists. Thank you, Saktiji, for giving me this opportunity. So, as we got from the discussion, India is one country which has argued relentlessly about its exceptionalism. But can there also be something called convenient values?
Are you asking?
I'm asking to all the panelists, whoever can respond to my
all
question.
mat karo yaar, all mein. Anyway, go ahead, please go ahead.
So, can there be something
We'll come to you.
Can there be something called convenient values? Several examples were cited saying how India is different from Pakistan in not endorsing a singular identity or religion-based rules. However, in the recent past, as was also reflected by Sanjay Baru sir, there is a growing concern reflected regarding some of the rules such as citizenship and NRC. So does it reflect continuity, contradiction or convenience in our values? Is there a different value system which operates with respect to persecuted communities such as Hindu, Punjabi, Sikhs and Christian at one side and Rohingyas on the other side? Or like sir also said, is there...
Keep your question to a question.
Yes,
Don't make it essay.
Is India becoming more like Western democracy by tightening our norms on citizenship and everything?
I have 2 questions, one for Professor Mayal and one for Sanjay Baru sir. First to Sanjay Baru sir. Sir, my question is also about juxtaposing of Citizenship Amendment Bill and India's economic performance. And so do you really think that because of this bill, Walmart or Lockheed Martin would not like to invest in India? And will it really affect India? And while we talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam relentlessly, since Nehru's time, as you said, the Vasudha is being governed by Westphalian system. So we don't have control. We might we might think that Vasudha is our Kutumba, but we cannot control. The borders and sovereignty are integral parts of the Westphalian system. So do you still think that that is a relevant approach? Or as Shakti Sinha sir said about Ekada Vipadam, that phrase, one truth and many sides, do you think we should make amends? And my question to Professor Mayal, sir, can you throw some more light on the differentiation you made of globalization and genuine universalization? Thank you.
I'll come to you. I'll come to you, sir. Don't worry. I've got two people ahead of you. I'll come to you.
Sir, good morning, sir. I am Justice Chandraya, a judge from Telangana High Court, former judge. First of all, I express my gratitude to the author and the learned members of the panel committee for explaining in the book written by our brother Sri Shakti Sinha Garu. I am grateful to you, sir. I had not gone through the book, but explained by the learned speakers, it has come to my mind that having regard to the national phenomena and the international phenomena, having regard to the domestic laws and international laws, with a reference to the value of human being, value of the family, value of the nation, and value of the international. In this scenario, how to define a word value with reference to individual, whether individual value has any nexus to the family value, whether the family value has any nexus with the national value, whether the national value has any nexus with the international value, having regard to that yesterday itself we have celebrated the human rights. I am greeting all of you that Human Rights Day celebration. Greetings to all of you because yesterday only you have celebrated. In this scenario, there is a talk about the world democracy. What is the world democracy? Or world parliament. Parliament is confined to each nation. Now we are thinking on the aspect of world parliament. In this scenario, how to correlate the values under the international law, values under the national law, and values of the individual to sustain the society in a peaceful manner, having experienced two world wars, First World War and Second World War, and the League of Nations and UNO, which are the basic concepts which have come into existence for the purpose of only peace and security. To how to protect the peace and security of the humanity as a whole with reference to the international law. This is my.
Thank you. Dr. Ghosa, last question for this round.
I think the question may be addressed to anyone in the panel. In your indices of values, would you also include foreign policy behavior or diplomatic behavior as a part of it? Now, the reason why I'm asking this question is that, well, there may be contradictions sometimes between the values you espouse or that you practice. But in terms of behavior pattern, it never changes. One example I'll give you, which many Southeast Asians told me. Indians or many other Westerners are very direct in their approach. Whenever they want something, they will tell you directly, no hiding anything. Southeast Asians, particularly the Malays, they don't say anything directly. There's a subtle thing, and the culture comes in their diplomatic behavior. Another example I'll give you. Between the one-to-one meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Jokowi, the President of Indonesia, I was told by someone very close to Jokowi that he talked about patrolling in the Malacca Straits, whether India could be included or not. There were translators. And Djokovic's response, I speak Bahasa, so that's why I speak in Bahasa. Coba aja. That means you can try. Now, when an Indonesian says coba aja,
No, it means no.
definitely no.
It means no.
But the translator could not really understand, possibly. And that's why in the newspaper it appeared 1 or 2 days that India might join the Malacca Strait thing. So this cultural behavior also sometimes plays a very important part in terms of foreign policy expression. So I think this should also be included as part of values. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Because you're like. Sanjay, I think you should start responding and then the others can join in.
To clarify, no, I'm not suggesting that we should modify our behavior fearing sanctions. No, that's not what my suggestion certainly is. After all, we withstood sanctions in the past. We went nuclear, we faced sanctions. And therefore, if I don't see, first of all, the US imposing any sanctions. You are absolutely right. They are no one to preach to us, given what Trump is doing in the US. But they are no model for us to emulate either, which is the point I'm making, that we live in a world where sectarianism is gaining ground. And I don't think Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is an idea that suggests that we should also join the sectarian nations of the world. Whether it is Christian nations or Jewish nations or Islamic nations, we are different. We have always taken great pride in being different, that we are not a one-religion nation. So therefore, let me clarify on that. On the whole question of economic interest versus national interest, which is in a sense what you said. The burden of my song in most of what I've written in the last 20 years is that at the end of the day, India has to prioritize its economic interests in the pursuit of its foreign policy. That is what I've been writing. I've written a whole book on this. And therefore, if there is a choice between taking a principled stand and adopting positions which meet our economic needs or interests, I would always argue there are economic, after all, we are a lower middle income country. We can pretend to be a rising power, major power, leading power, whatever, all these pretensions are fine. End of the day, we are one of the poorer countries of the world. We have at least 20% of our population below the poverty line. We have large number of unemployed young people. So our priority is economic development. And whatever we do with respect to the rest of the world must first address that priority. This has been my argument. I mean, you can have other views, I don't mind. But my argument has been this, and therefore, I would say that at the end of the day, whatever we do should serve our economic interests. Now, your question is whether the positions we have taken on the citizenship bill will hurt our economic interests. I don't know. And if it does, then I would, of course, certainly say we have to be more mindful of our economic interests. But, the reason I worry about the citizenship bill is not because it would come in the way of our economic interests. That's not the reason I worry. I worry because we are talking today about values. And I'm making the point that successive prime ministers and the current president of India have held up the idea of unity and diversity, of India, being, whole world, one family, inclusiveness being the value driving our worldview and our personality with respect to the outside world. Will this now harm that image? That's the question I'm raising. I mean, we have to wait and watch. The rest of the world is cynical. Maybe they'll say, okay, India, we don't mind working with a Hindu India, if that's what is going to happen. But my point is about our own self-image. Is that the image we want to give to the world? Or do we think it serves our interests, in fact, to be seen as a plural secular democracy?
Sanjay, could just add a half a question just suggested, I think, but somehow, supposing India was, and this is what a critique of the government told me just 3-4 days ago. She said that supposing India had been growing at 8% plus for the last 3-4 years, criticisms of the government in the Western media would have been muted, cynically speaking. Huh?
That strengthens my argument. Because of their economic interests, they are not criticizing you. But that only strengthens my argument.
No, I'm not. I'm just see whether you agreed. Now, Osman, you have a question.
Well, just before I come to your question, I'd like to link it with a comment on the previous question about convenient values and the final one on diplomatic behavior, which I very much agree with. I think what you said about convenient values is very convincing. There is a way in which the Indian discussion is beginning to echo what is happening all over Europe at the moment, including in my own country. I would merely take refuge in a remark of one of the French Enlightenment philosophes who pointed out that hypocrisy was the price that vice pays to virtue. So we ought to be slightly wary of thinking that being hypocritical is such a bad thing. It may be a second best thing, but what we've got, then we should rest on it. So that's one point. On globalization against universalism, I think personally, and this is very much a personal view, that there are two models which came out of the West of international society. One was what has been referred to as the Westphalian system. It's a rough shorthand, but we know what it means, and it is, I think, the view which is more popular outside the West now than it is within the West. And it seems to me it's the better legacy because it allows more traction in dealing across cultural and other barriers. The other alternative, of course, is liberal internationalism, which has been the flood tide in the West. Not merely, I mean, everyone, it's convenient to put it all on America. Actually, Trump has pulled back from it. But it's convenient to put it all on America. But the EU and Britain have been just as strong in forgetting the history and promoting the idea of liberal internationalism. The problem is not that liberal international values are not are in themselves good values. Who could be a good against human rights? It's like being against apple pie. It's not that. It is that the sort of expeditionary enthusiasm with which, since the end of the Cold War, Western countries have been prepared to reach deep inside other countries which they don't fully understand, in the way in which they reach deep inside their own societies. But at least when they reach deep inside their own societies, they have legislative control of what they're doing. You may like what they're doing, you may not like what they're doing, but it's their show. If they then export that into their foreign policy, they're beginning to enter a much more dangerous area. If one says, what is the difference then between globalization and universalism? I will fall back on the problem with globalization, which has many benefits and has brought riches. I mean, it's left an awful lot of people in abject poverty, but it has brought quite a lot of people advantages. But the disadvantage of it is that it operates out of a one-size-fits-all assumption about human societies and what they look like. Whereas a true universalism, I hope we're not reaching it, but we're stretching for it in this book, is if you like, and it's been said around this table this morning, unity in diversity. It is the idea that one can have different roads to the same positive goal. And that brings me to the final point about diplomatic behavior. And I think that I would put it, I agree very much with what was said, but I would emphasize that empathy, which is the diplomatic skill, is a value, and a very important value. And it can come from very strange sources. I would think, I mean, I'll take one example and then shut up, but I recently examined an excellent PhD thesis on the role of empathy in international relations. And the young woman who is British but is now at Yale, who wrote this thesis, used the Kissinger-Nixon opening to China as her case study. And in it, she really showed Nixon, who I have to say, like many liberals, I have always found both Nixon and Kissinger particularly unattractive political figures. But when I finished this book, I had much more sympathy with Nixon than I would have ever believed possible to have, because he really did his work in that diplomatic mission. And he was completely unfazed by the problem that has come up around the table of this contradiction between values and interests. He told a story in the course of preparing himself, which wasn't about China. It was about the Chappaquiddick incident when Teddy Kennedy was responsible for drowning his then girlfriend. And Nixon, felt great empathy for Teddy Kennedy. And he expressed it quite openly. At the same time, he was quite honest about the fact that this opened up political opportunities for him, which he was not going to miss. And this seems to me, it takes you back to another European who really understood this tension, but I think got it wrong in the end, and that was Max Weber. I mean, Max Weber's idea of a politician was somebody who had to have a vision. He couldn't just be a bureaucrat. He had to have a vision. And preferably, he had to have charisma. But of course, Max Weber believed that if you had those qualities, you would have them on the side of the angels. And you would be prepared to take the consequences of your actions. So that's what differentiated a politician, a really good politician from other people, is that they took actions. They knew they weren't quite the same as the actions they would take in private life. They would express their values, but they might have unintended consequences which were damaging. The trouble with Weber's, in other words, brilliant essay, I think, is that Hitler fits the model perfectly. I mean, there's no way in which you can guarantee what these good values are. I mean, Hitler was prepared, even unto death, to accept responsibility for his actions. So I think but faced with these contradictions and difficulties, I think that empathy and careful sort of Sherpa work in unpacking the complications of Malaysian, Indonesian behavior. It's a brilliant example and very important, I think. Thank you.
I want them to respond to the questions already raised. 30 seconds.
China, Kissinger has also accepted. In fact, he was certainly not on invite. It is a kind of afterthought, you know.
But that's all right. I don't think so. We can let it be there.
We would like to know, was it not just against Russia that Nixon went there and had an opening with China, or it was because of
No, let's not go off track. Let's not go off track. The other questions raised is open to all the panel.
Just a very quick one and a brief one. I think, although probably the judge from Telangana has gone, he asked about how to correlate the values at 4 or 5 systems from family to the highest international level. And my answer would be that if you look at these different forms of organizations, individual, family, community organizations, state governments, union governments, international states, one element is common, the people. And if the people are driven by values, sometimes they claim to be driven by values, sometimes they pretend to be driven by values, sometimes they just pay tribute to the values, do something else, but values do guide us. If they do so at one level, second level, third level, fourth level, it just beats logic to say at the final level, they don't count. And finally, I think the very fact that the history of past 100 years, League of Nations, United Nations, human rights, WTO, the rest of it all, nothing is perfect, they're all flawed. But the fact that mankind is working to produce this entire architecture, which is based on values, norms, and laws, and all the time we are asking for them, shows very clearly that this is not something we are living in a fantasy world. Thank you.
We'll take the second round of questions, unless you want to answer.
Well, there was no specific question asked to me, and of course there have been very interesting observations. But I thought I'd just comment on just 2 points. One is this whole question of diplomatic behavior versus national culture. Of course, that's the way we diplomats conduct business. Certainly your cultural behavior does determine, but ultimately the skills in which there are, specifically on the question of Indonesia and Malaysia having to convey certain things. But finally, the values that they would reflect, I think, do matter, even if the behavior that they follow is part of their cultural pattern of how they conduct business. Moving on to the whole conflict about national values with your international values as they evolve through international agreements, I personally feel that once nations have adhered and assumed responsibilities under an international agreement, certainly they've been through their churning of national debate, whether they'll be able to take on those obligations. But I think that once you've assumed those international obligations, it is important for those countries to accept them and fulfill them. And so therefore, your ability to follow a rules-based international system therefore becomes a very important national character, and if you value it, you will adhere to it. I don't want to make this into a citizenship amendment bill discussion, because ours is just about this book and the value, and that's a much more complicated subject in this noisy, cacophonic democracy of ours. But I would still say I have full faith, and this is civilizational, historical, over the years, that we as a nation, as a people, as individuals, have always, irrespective of the churning and the debate and the rhetoric, we will remain inherently, because we've lived with so much diversity, multiple languages, multiple religions. I think that inherent character will not be taken away. And I think there are enough systems of checks and balances within our system of this plural democracy to ensure that we remain that.
Gentleman there, and then the lady next. I'll come to you.
Except that I have been a student of international relation, having taught it for the last 30, 40 years, and come to a conclusion which is slightly different from what Professor James Mayall summarized. I'm only concentrating on that comment because I have not read the book. But I'm impressed by the subject, which though not from what I understand the conclusion, though not relevant, it's useful. Like all useful things, they are also not always, worthwhile. The worthwhile thing, they are not always relevant. And I think IR is one of those. Having taught this for so long, I do not share the optimism of Professor James Mayall in terms of the contribution of scholarship to either the predictability of the imponderables of IR, much less to shape its course in directions which are desirable. And I think, and that is where my slight, I know we can discuss this ad valorem, like we have on many things. I think the problem is precisely what he argued based on his experience about the editorship of this volume and the panelists here. They are all very good, but I suspect that they are more conjunctural than causal. IR has not benefited precisely by, I think, what you are recommending as a necessity, diplomats as the best interpreters of international relations. In fact, that has been its major tragedy. I'm one of those non-mainstream IR students, and I have liked people like Fred Halliday, your former colleague in the LSE, and others, rather than me. I think the relationship between a scholarship and practice has to be a relationship of tensions to benefit both scholars and practice. Otherwise, scholars who either become practitioners, much less with their goal on becoming diplomats, tend to precisely rationalize. So to that extent, values are very useful, behavior. To rationalize policies which are based on not always national interest. Nation itself is a very contestable composition if you accept that it's an imaginary community. Now, who represents a nation? Nehru in those days and the perpetrators, who built up our constitution, or the present interpreters of the constitution in the citizenship bill?
We are running slightly against time.
Yeah, I'll finish. So I finished in fact. My own argument would be to encourage Professor Beall, I know it's a little too late, considering that he had opted beginning as a diplomat and shifted to scholarship, to reconsider whether he has contributed more to the understanding of IR as a scholar or as a diplomat. Thank you.
For his next book. Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
My question will come at the end of the observations that I've made, one on the western side of the world and the other on the eastern side of the world, in the world of diplomacy, values and ethics in diplomacy. Now, I find that India had a very strong voice, going against the grain of what the Western thought. But recently, I find we have weakened our voice in diplomacy, because when Obama had removed sanctions against Cuba, and this gentleman, Mr. President Trump, comes and adds on the sanctions on Cuba. We didn't raise our voice despite our having very good relationship with Cuba. Secondly, with Israel, we have a totally opposite things happening, because America is very close to Israel, so we do whatever we want with Israel despite our good relations with the Middle East, and they don't like what we are doing. Coming to the eastern side, the young, new, the members are treating us like a big brother, and sometimes we have a very ding-dong relationship with Nepal, with Maldives, with Sri Lanka, but today they are wooing us. I would like to know from the panelists, what is really most important in value and ethics in politics? To raise our voice against what's happening around the world, or do we follow our interests in economic terms? The countries are wooing us, Nepal, Maldives, despite their having very bad relations with India in the past, but they are wooing us now because of their economy, and they are thinking of their values or what concerns them in economy. So what are we following? What guidance are we following?
Lady next and then.
My question is that how do you deal with the value action gap in the international perspective, especially when something like climate change is an issue? So now, be it I take the Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which is the idealistic view, or I take the utilitarian approach, or I take the national interest protection of, population, common element is everyone is plagued by the problem. But when someone pulls out of the Paris Accord, there is burning of the Amazon forest, our voices, ma'am has just pointed, are kind of muted. So what's happening to the value action gap?
I'll keep it very short. Is the conflict between values and interests not really an artificial construct? Because while I agree that in the immediate short term, there could be a conflict between values and interests may well triumph, as many examples have been given. If a nation or a leader persistently violates values, is that over a period of time, could be the long term or could be even the medium term, not be against the national interest of that country. Tiny example, I'll quote, I'll take the example of Mussolini, which the ambassador mentioned. We all agree that he was not a good fellow and harmed Italy greatly. But if you went back to 1935, he would be considered having done a great job. He made the trains run on time. The rest of Europe was admiring of him. But over a period, the view has changed. So is there really this tension if you take it over a period of time?
Valid point, absolutely. Let's now, very quickly.
During the deliberations, there was a mention of Hindu India and its friction with values. However, we have seen across ages, Hindu India
and its
friction with values.
Achha, okay.
However, we've seen across ages, even in the current day, the aspiration that we have, the look that we have, the focus that we have globally is towards developed countries. Now, if development is the main variable, why can't we have that variable to be the cut-through rather than religion to be the variable for the cut-through? Why I'm saying? Because in Europe, we'll find a lot of countries which actually position them as Christian countries, but they have got development, and that's how we look towards them. Now, to get the development, we need to be accommodative, we need to be empathetic, we need to have all the secular type of, sub-variables that's there.
You're giving a prescription, not a question, right?
No, I'm saying why we are not focusing on development to be the cut-through rather than religion.
Okay, thanks. Panelists, who wants to respond to these questions? Please answer. Yeah.
I think I'm really excited
from
about...
Sanjay, Preeti onwards, all of us can
just
respond.
on one question, which is how to cope with the value interest gap, in action, specifically on the climate change. I think this is a very good question. This is at the heart of the discourse today on climate change as one of the critical challenges for the world. We all know that governments have their limitations and they have their compulsions, and therefore they probably will never ever do enough to deal with this challenge. The only way the gap can be bridged is if the public opinion really becomes not merely assertive but aggressive. And in that composition of public opinion, the vulnerable segments of society, the discriminated ones, the poor ones, youth, women, the more they are able to raise their voices, and the more media is able to accommodate their voices, the better chance there is of this gap being bridged.
Anything to respond to the questions? Only if you want, Sanjay. There was a specific question to you.
Well, I think my friend Ashwini and I are not on different sides. I did have a very short time as a diplomat before crossing the floor. I would agree with you entirely, Ashwini, that there is a built-in tension between practitioners and scholars. And it is probably a necessary tension, and you just have to live with that. When I was giving praise, which I will not recant, to the diplomatic profession, it was from the outside looking in, not from the inside looking out. So I think that is it's quite important. On Ravi's point, I think you're right in a way. I mean, I think there is something slightly false between this, in the dichotomy between interests and values. And I would say that, human beings are normative creatures. They can't actually open their mouths without having a value embedded in there somewhere. Keynes, I think, said that, if you go to the most practical people who never have had a philosophical thought in their lives, and press them, you'll find they're slaves to some long dead philosopher or economist.
Defunct.
Defunct, yeah. And I think that's true. I mean, I think that time changes our perspective on these things.
Sanjay, anything, right?
I share these last remarks of Professor Mayal. But you know, Ravi, and the lady there, you can always find quote-unquote values to couch interests. Take climate change, for example. What are we saying? We have said this is climate imperialism, right? That the developed countries are depriving us of the opportunity of development by preventing the utilization of hydrocarbons. So it's a value of struggle against climate imperialism. The pursuit of development is a value you need in order to essentially address your basic economic need of burning more coal to get more power. So an economic interest is but one can think of other such interests which are pursued within the garb of values. And there I think you're right. I mean, people like to believe that at the end of the day, nations like individuals pursue values rather than interests because we are not in a Hobbesian world of naked self-interest. And therefore, it's the responsibility of scholars to imagine the values that are couching the interests that diplomats pursue.
Good, thank you. Just to quickly wind up very quickly. One, absolutely, we should not always find a dichotomy between values and interest. One, it is an evolving situation. Where I would slightly disagree with Sanjay is that on the climate change specifically, accepting climate imperialism, at Paris we still said it is a common future for us. We will accept a cap. 2050, but we will accept a cap. So it's not that countries will always pursue a very short-term narrow interest. They also look at the long term, which is where the values actually come in. So if Mussolini was very popular in 35, by 43 he was running for his life in Italy itself. He was killed by Italians. He was not killed by an invading force. So the partisans killed him. So I think the situation does keep changing, but I mean, you can't be hung up on old shibboleths all the time. India voted for the creation of Israel in 1947. We voted for it. We recognized Israel in 1947. We don't have diplomatic relations with Israel. We recognized it in 1947 itself. And today's West Asia, who is Israel's best friend in that region? Saudi Arabia. Because countries also evolve with times. Countries are not always stuck upon time. Unfortunately, Cuba will follow the agenda because for one, they are also not a paragon of democratic virtue. Besides being not very relevant to our interests in the long term, they're also not a paragon of democratic virtue. So I mean, India should raise its voice, but you have limited capacity, limited resources to do, and that is also a value. How do I use my limited capital to achieve the interest of my people? At the end of the day, you're interested in the welfare of your society. That is a value also. It's not selfish in a very narrow sense. If the ruling class is not interested in its own welfare of its own people, it has no business to be there. It must abdicate. So therefore, these are evolving situations. Contingency value for permanent value chalta hai. Things keep changing. Don't get fixed permanently, not written on stone, fortunately. I think we've had an excellent discussion. Our panelists have brought in lots of very, very, very different ideas from the book, from outside the book. And as both the authors, editors, James and Sanjay have told us, this is just the beginning. There's lots more to be said. Africa must be there without sacrificing Myanmar. Absolutely. But we do need to understand Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, just to name 4 countries. There are many more, but I guess you must obviously keep in track. Nigeria will soon really be one of the largest countries in the world. That is the reality. So we obviously need a much more detailed arguments. And yes, we must try to bridge the gap. But each time you bridge the gap between theory and practice, a new gap opens up somewhere else, which is what dialectics is all about. So from my part, thank you very, very much. Let me now hand it over to the hosts.
Good afternoon, everyone. It has been an enriching and truly engaging one since morning. We are running short on time, certainly, but it would be incorrect if there's no vote of thanks. So events like this would be really impossible to arrange without the support of the team that we have behind us. And they work tirelessly to make this event successful. So kindly allow me a few minutes for the Thanksgiving. I would first of all like to thank Sri Shakti Sinha ji for chairing the discussion today, and all the panelists, Ambassador Preeti Saran, Dr. Sanjay Baru, Professor James Mail, and Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia for their valuable inputs and sharing their knowledge, experience, and of course their time. Some of our panelists have also written reviews of the book on various publishing platforms, and we thank them sincerely for that. I consider myself extremely fortunate to be a part of this project on values and foreign policy, and towards that I want to express my gratitude to Sri Krishnan Srinivasan, former Indian Foreign Secretary, who has been leading this project for the past 3 years now. I also want to thank Mr. Sanjay Pulipaka, who has been guiding me very patiently ever since I joined a career as a researcher. My heartfelt thanks to Dr. Rajat Kathuria, the Director and Chief Executive at ICRIER, for his constant encouragement in our work. And we are thankful to all the authors for their chapters in the book, and also grateful to everyone who has contributed articles to our website. We additionally express our thankfulness to the publishers of the book. They have been very patiently dealing with us. Please join me in thanking ICRIER's administrative team, which is led by Mr. Manmeet Ahuja, including Neha, Krishan, Rajesh ji, Sharad ji. They have been instrumental. They're all here with all of us. Probably not here in the room, but they're closely here. They have been consistently providing us huge support in making all the logistical arrangements for every event in ICRIER. And it would have been impossible to put up our project website without the technical support that we get from our IT manager, Rajkumar ji. And he solely handles all the digital components at ICRIER. Let's have a round of applause for him as well, special one for him. We are grateful to the Tata Trusts for their financial support. We also thank our accounts team at ICRIER, Prabhat ji, Rishi ji, and Ram, and under the leadership of Secretary Ma'am Geeta Nair ji for their continual support. We thank the institutes in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Kolkata who have partnered in organizing the panel discussions in these cities respectively. I take this opportunity to thank the India Habitat Center for extending their support with the venue, as well as the Old World Hospitality for the food. We are indeed very happy to see so many of you taking time from your schedules and participating in today's discussion in huge numbers. Hence, we thank all of you for joining us here today. Let's have a big round of applause. Thank you so very much. Let's proceed for lunch.